Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by Lanzcape, which is, I hope you've heard, a new monitoring and advocacy advice app, focusing initially on the EU. I'm Michel, CEO of Lanzcape, and I'll be moderating, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers who are from the company Advocacy Strategy. Advocacy Strategy is an innovator in codifying public affairs best practice for organizations. And the co-founders are Alan and Paul, and today they'll be talking about mastering the new EU legislative cycle, which, as we know, is kicking off now and will be running for the next 5 years. We have an hour scheduled, and we'll break it into 2 sections, each one followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to post questions in the chat during the segments, and then we'll take those in order at the end of each respective segment. The goal is to provide some concrete tools that will empower your work, focusing today on 2 critical objectives. First, in order to develop a proper plan, you need to have a full grasp of the process and key milestones that govern the first couple of years of this new cycle. Second, we'll see how to create structure and build alignment between your plan and the institutional and political milestones. So, Paul, over to you. Could you start by explaining the EU's legislative timeline over the coming months? What are the key things that all public affairs professionals need to know?
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. So just a brief introduction of myself. So my name is Paul Schotten. I am one half of Advocacy Strategy alongside Alan. My background is in public affairs. I've had a good 10 years working in Brussels with some of you who are present today, and another 10 years working in academia and research, teaching and researching around public affairs and influence. And indeed, a lot of that background brought me to this presentation and the topic that we talk about today, which is understanding the structure and process of the public affairs and the policymaking process itself. And that was very much something that really interested me as I developed and worked in Brussels, was really understanding both the policymaking processes as well as understanding the structures that go behind building public affairs and advocacy campaigns. So today I'm going to be starting you off by looking at the process, and then Alan will be taking over after me, looking very much at the tools and the methods you can use to structure your advocacy. So, of course, 2024 is a year of change. We have new priorities, we have new actors, we have the von der Leyen II Commission coming into function. The process is already well underway. But there are still some major milestones taking place in the last months of this year or in the second half of this year. And these processes, of course, are key to setting the agenda of the European Commission for the next 5 years. So we're very much in an agenda setting phase. But at the same time as well, we have both work looking at setting the annual work program for the next year, 2025, as well as the work programs in the coming years. And we're going to be looking briefly at those processes as well. To that, of course, you should add yourself, of course, your own work on the legislation and the legislative priorities and the policies that your organization has selected as key priorities for the coming period. And so, mapping these processes, I think, is an essential component to structuring your advocacy. It's one of the key tenets that allows you then to understand what is taking place in the policy environment, what of these different processes and milestones matter to you and your organization, and what will you do to engage with them and interact with them, and of course, what will you not be doing as well? So those 2 questions on the 2 sides of the same coin. So moving on, if we look a little bit in more detail at what is taking place this year in particular, we see here in the 3 boxes, we have a very summarized timeline of the new priorities process that I just described, the work developing the 2025 work program for the European Commission, and for comparative purposes, a normal year, shall we call it, where the European Commission will be developing its work program for 2026 and the subsequent years. So looking at these processes, we see, of course, that the new priorities have already been well advanced in terms of the work selecting and nominating the new leadership of the European Commission in particular, as well as, of course, the elections leading to the new MEPs taking up function. So this process is quite advanced, but it is a process, of course, of continuity on the one hand and change on the other. It's a process whereby the European Commission itself and the services of the Commission are looking at ensuring transition from the previous Commission to the new Commission, looking at ensuring that the files they have been working on are transitioned over into the mandates of the new commissioners, with the additional flavor of the European Commission's President's new priorities that will, of course, take into account the evolving external context and the big changes that have taken place between 2019 and 2024, notably the energy crisis, the food security issues, and many other significant changes in our environment. So to take a brief walk through some of these major steps, we of course are looking now at a rentrée or a September that will be colored mainly, of course, by the confirmation hearings and the election, of course, of the head of the European Commission, as well as the new commissioners. And to this process, of course, we will be layering the definition of the strategic priorities of the European Commission. And so within the Commission itself, we'll be seeing this process of confirming the new commissioners within the European Parliament, as well as the European Commission itself, defining its strategic priorities and formulating the mandate letters that will then shape the work of each of the individual commissioners, leading to, at the end of the year, the confirmation, hopefully by November, of a new commission, which will then be able to rapidly take control of the work program for 2025. Because indeed, the process for defining the 2025 work program is a compressed process, given the nature of this year. We're seeing that the European Commission will need to, as soon as the hearings are completed and the commissioners are confirmed, will need to then hand over to the commissioners for the finalization of that program towards the end of the year in November and its publication. So we have a compressed program, and if you want to compare that, and of course, by January, we will be in a situation where there will be a new European Commission work program in place and ready for rollout over the course of the next year. By July of next year, we will then see that same process starting with a longer timeline with the cabinet retreats, where they'll be discussing by DG the priorities of the coming year. There'll be a College of Commissioners exchange, looking at this new work program for 2026. This process is supported, of course, by the Secretariat General, which will be preparing a draft and collating the information and reviewing the information coming out of the Directorates General. It will then, of course, be discussed and validated by the commissioners in a series of meetings and retreats, and then, of course, reflected and published through the State of the Union and decisions and publications towards the end of the year. So indeed, the 2026 work program will also be, of course, maybe a stronger reflection of the priorities, given that there is a compressed timeline between the strategic priorities of the Commission being validated at the end of this year and the publication only a few months later of the new work program for the subsequent year. So potentially the 2025 work program will be more a reflection of that transition process and the carrying over and the completion of some elements of the previous Commission's term, whereas the 26 program will be maybe a stronger validation of the new strategic priorities. So if we want to have a little bit look at this process in a bit more detail, and here the question is that we're trying to address is not so much only what is the process and what is taking place at each step in that process and who are the key actors, but also what action potentially can you and your organization take. Now, when I say action, of course, I also mean what action may you decide not to take, because there are different levels of engagement that are open to you as an organization and that are very much shaped by the type of organization that you're at. But looking, of course, at this period, and we, of course, estimate the time, given that there is a degree of uncertainty as to the length of the processes, we can see that there are three different processes or different processes taking place now in September to November. We, of course, have the commissioners' hearings, and here we look at it from the perspective of the Parliament, where the Parliament will, of course, be interviewing and questioning the candidate commissioners, formulating questions, putting them to those commissioners, and potentially even calling for the replacement of one or more candidates. At the same time, the European Commission services, we must not forget, it's a two-sided equation with the Parliament on the one hand interviewing the candidates and the European Commission on the other hand supporting those candidates through the development and the drafting of speaking points and Q&A documents to brief and prepare, with the support of the services and the Secretariat General, the candidate commissioners. And so what can you do in that context and in that period and in the coming months that we are just discussing right now is, of course, research and understand the questions that the MEPs are trying to put to the commissioners. You should, of course, in relation to your own strategic priorities and the issues that you wish to drive forward, as well as in the view of building relations with MEPs that are either returning or new to the Parliament, use this opportunity to potentially seed questions or discuss with MEPs on key committees the questions that you may well want to put forward. So that is very much engaging with new stakeholders and existing stakeholders to push forward some of the key issues that matter to you and your organization, while at the same time gathering intelligence, watching these debates, watching, of course, the reactions of the commissioners to the questions and the answers that are given. Bearing in mind that the commissioners themselves, though framed by the policy and the strategic priorities of the president, as well as by the mission letters, will be adding their own personal color and their own personal tint to their positions on some of these key issues. So here we are really looking to have clarity upon the intentions of the work program in the coming period and understanding, of course, and influencing some of those issues. In parallel, as we know, the European Commission is preparing that transition process. So the services have been drafting mission letters with the support, of course, of the Secretariat General. And those letters have been evolving in an iterative process with feedback shaped by the priorities of the President of the European Commission. And these letters then are very important in shaping our understanding of key files within the European Commission, within the DGs that matter to you and your organization. So understanding and aligning with the drafts, identifying and gathering drafts of these letters, discussing with key stakeholders within the European Commission as to what is going into these documents and what color they may have, all with a view to having a clear analysis of what will be taking place and what will be the mandates of those new commissioners once confirmed in October, November. Finally, of course, we must not forget that the European Council will be having a new president taking office, and there it is also important to work on building connections with the office. So we're in a position now in this phase of September to November, looking at the shaping of priorities, the building of your networks with new actors within the Parliament, as well as key actors within the Commission services. Now, if we move forward a little bit, we see then that we are now moving into a sort of a voting and a decision-making phase in estimating in November, where we see the new priorities will crystallize following the vote by the European Parliament, confirming the High Representative, the College, and the President of the Commission will be confirmed into function, allowing then for the publication of the strategic priorities. And there again, we have this dual process of analyzing and understanding these priorities because they will shape the priorities of your own organization, but also understanding the processes that will go into these decisions. So understanding the voting intentions of the political groups, supporting and providing clarity to key MEPs. As I mentioned before, obtaining official copies of the mission letters, as well as mapping the new actors and the new staff within the cabinet of the commissioners that have been voted through by the Parliament and appointed. So we're looking here indeed in this phase of November to December, very much trying to understand indeed what are the priorities? What are the priorities for your organization in relation to the strategic priorities of the Commission? Understanding what are the new actors and mapping those new actors and those new teams in particular within the European Commission, having already previously mapped earlier in the year the new European Parliament and the many new MEPs that have come to join that institution. So once the European Commission has come into function, the college has been formed, attention then shifts from the priorities and the nomination process to the work program process. And like we mentioned in the earlier phase, here we're looking very much at the new college coming together to discuss the draft work program, which has been put together with input from the Directorates General, coordinated by the Secretariat, and then shaped, of course, by the strategic priorities. So these new college commissions will come together to discuss. A lot of the work program for 2025 has already taken shape, but it is certainly my belief that there is room for maneuver here. The commissions themselves have the ability to put some color onto those priorities and to shape the content of those issues with their own, of course, individual intentions. So indeed, November to December is a period of transition from the agenda setting phase to the process of defining the draft legislative process, the drafting, moving into the legislative phase of the European Commission. And of course, this whole process runs in parallel, we mustn't forget, to the startup of legislative work on existing files. So the 111 plus existing legislative files that have been carried over from the previous term to the new term will then start up with legislative work in the Parliament in October. In true, there's some work has already begun. And that layer, of course, needs to be added for you in your consideration. Because indeed here we're talking very much about understanding and engaging with the process of forming the strategic priorities, as well as the process of formulating the work programs and the new legislative agenda for the coming period. So moving on to my last slide, I just wanted to again reiterate that at the end of the year, we will then see the work program for 2025 take place, and it will reflect, as I said, those key strategic priorities, as well as the intentions of the European commissioners that have been nominated. And here, of course, it is essential that you try and obtain a draft copy of this work program as it is being finalized. And then, of course, that you assess this document, linking it back to your own prioritization exercises within your organization, looking to understand the potential impact, financial, reputational, and other of those issues upon your organization, as well as defining your level of engagement with those, as well as considering for many organizations how to address issues that are potentially not reflected there, priorities and files and proposals that you would like to see made and you would like to see potentially introduced into future work programs and potentially shaping the future color of the priorities of the Commission over the coming 5 years. So make sure you engage with this process. And of course, that raises the question of understanding to what extent your organization should be taking a proactive or more of a passive approach, and making those choices between those strategies is, of course, something that you need to reflect on. But in all cases, there is a great deal to be done around prioritizing your issues. There is a great deal to be done around intelligence gathering and gathering these key documents that we have mentioned and information on these key processes, as well as stakeholders, and mapping those. And bringing this together, of course, one of the key things that I wanted to highlight by going through this timeline is, as I mentioned at the beginning, it forms the foundation of a process of developing structured campaigns. And in doing so, of course, what we are trying to layer is an understanding of these different and overlapping processes of the strategic priorities, Work Programme 2025, Work Programme 2026, your own legislative agendas. And by looking at those, you can then define where are the milestones, what objectives would you be setting for your own organization in relation to those? And therefore working back to what actions and what strategies would you like to put in place and what work. So in a sense, this is the beginning of a strategic conversation about what proactive strategy and what proactive campaign can you build to engage with these processes alongside your legislative issues in the coming period? And how can you take more of a project management approach in doing so? And that's, of course, something that Alan will be talking about, so I shouldn't really go into too much more detail about that. So maybe I'll stop there. And of course, maybe one last note is we do have much more detailed breakdowns of these processes. We have developed these over the course of the last year, looking at those, trying really to define in great detail what are the steps in the processes, what is the timing, who are the actors, what actions could we potentially take, and what resources do we need in order to engage with those, all with a view then of supporting the process of developing campaigns. And my personal preference, of course, is to develop campaigns in the form of Gantt charts or action plans, but there's a whole range of tools you can use to do that. So, okay, I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, I can answer them now, or I could also take them at the end of this webinar when Alan has also made his contribution.
Paul, thank you very much. That was substantial and as expected, I have to say. We could maybe wait to see if anyone has any questions. We have a couple. I have one which you might take a minute to address now, Paul. What would you say is, if you had to choose a key moment this autumn, what would be one thing? We all have so much we're doing. We all have so much to remember. Just one thing people should focus on.
Well, of course, one of the key milestones has just passed. So, the first thing I have to say is make sure you've analyzed, of course, the strategic guidelines that have been recently published, because they will give you a very strong idea of the priorities that will emerge from the European Commission in the coming months. Thereafter, I think an area of strong focus will be indeed, I think all organizations, no matter their size and the level of engagement that they have pre-existingly with the institutions, should be looking to engage with the hearings in terms of engaging with MEPs in their key committees and using the hearing process as a means of strengthening relationships and establishing new relationships with those key MEPs. And in doing so, I would recommend, of course, that when engaging with them, the focus should be less on your policy priorities and maybe coming to them with specific asks about specific potential pieces of legislation, and maybe focusing more on supporting those MEPs in their objective of questioning and shaping the priorities of the commissioners and testing those commissioners. So really providing them with assistance in that process, of course, with a degree of color.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. We do have a couple of more minutes in this segment, so I'm going to ask you another question. Can you really influence an annual work program? And even more urgently right now, is it too late to influence the 2025 work program? So a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer in terms of, I think it is dependent upon a number of variables. Indeed, now we're very far advanced within the process of setting the strategic priorities for the coming period. So there, I would say the ship has sailed to a large degree. And depending upon the side of your organization, the extent to which you represent horizontal interests will shape your ability as well as your pre-existing network. So the more researched you are, the larger you are, and the more representative you are of a wider group of interests, then the greater your ability to shape those priorities. But indeed, looking towards the Work Programme 2025, I believe that for those larger organizations, there is still an opportunity to shape that process, looking at the coming into function of the new commissioners and the limited rounds we'll see in late November. But indeed, it's a very difficult year and a difficult process to achieve significant change. So we're looking more for nudges than major shifts. And indeed, I would say then attention should definitely turn to the 2026 work program and the work that will start up in earnest in the summer of 2025, where there will be a much more open and drawn out process, offering a lot more opportunity for influence. And of course, one that will provide the institutions with more time as well to digest the new leadership and of course, therefore shape and color the work program 2026 much more in line with the new von der Leyen strategic priorities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to combine two more questions into one. We just have a couple of more minutes. They go well together. When will we return to the full legislative activity? I would say, for lack of a better word, normal or routine legislative work. And what is happening with the pending files? So the pending OLP files that are or may be carried over. Okay, so kind of a little bundle of two questions there.
Yes, so it's my understanding that the Parliament right now, of course, has come back to work this week, and they've turned their attention not just to the hearings, but of course to also reviewing the files within the committees. Committees themselves have the key group advisors, and the key roles have been determined. And now the question is indeed reviewing who are the rapporteurs and the shadow rapporteurs on those 100+ files that were carried over. Now, of course, it doesn't mean automatically that all those files will be continued, but I think prior experience tends to show that this is the case, unless there are some major political and high-level political opposition to some of those files. We should see most of them continue through. I believe the Parliament has made a commitment to the Council to be ready to continue negotiations from October onwards. So I think we should be looking at that process kicking off within the next, well, at the end of the month.
Okay, thank you. And in the meantime, another question did come in from Tim Bayer-Helm. Can you see it there, Paul?
Yes.
Otherwise, I'll just read it out so that everybody can hear it. So what role/input do you see the political groups in the EP transnational political families and their think tanks having in the policymaking process, particularly given the EPP's 7Ds publication?
Yeah. Well, I think that the political families, I'm not sure I'll be able to answer this in substantial detail, but I think that the political families, of course, have a strong shaping role, not just in the European Parliament's work now with the hearings and the types of questions that will be put to the commissioners. I think that there will, of course, be a great deal of pressure put to drive forward each political group's agenda. And of course, the EPP will have a lion's share of that attention and that ability to table the questions and drive forward its agenda there. But at the same time, of course, we know that the President of the Commission comes from the EPP family, and that political group and that political family has, of course, a lot of influence over the adjustments that will be made between the draft guidelines and the final strategic priorities. So nothing is set in stone now until November. So there is still possibility there to influence and to shape. And indeed, that influence and shaping process tends to happen at the higher levels here.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Super substantial segment. And again, I should let everyone know we will be sharing the slides, this entire deck afterwards with all attendees. So I know there's a lot in there, and you'll be getting that by email afterwards. Okay, let's go over to Alan. Alan, Paul has shown us what we can expect this autumn. I've lost, there we go. Can you outline two things, how to structure public affairs and what should be the focus of that at this point? So how to prioritize one's public affairs focus in the coming, in this autumn.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon for most people, I'm assuming. Good morning or good evening if you're not in Europe. It's great to be here. It's great to be talking to you a little bit about how you then give some public affairs structure to manage all of the different things that Paul has mentioned in the first half an hour. So very briefly, my name is Alan Hardacre. I'm the other half of advocacy strategy. I've been in Brussels for 25 years now, trying to work out how to do exactly what we're talking about on this webinar, how to manage political processes and organize yourself to be as efficient and successful as possible. So let's get into the second part about how do you organize or structure, and what does that mean for public affairs professionals right now as we enter this once every 5-year period at the beginning of an EU cycle. So I pick up on something that Paul mentioned at the beginning of his piece. He mentioned that it's very much a time of continuity and change. And there he was very focused on the policy space. There is a continuity and change institutionally. What does he mean by this? Well, I think what he means by this was there's continuity in terms of files. So there's pending files, but there's also implementing and delegated acts. The Green Deal is going to give birth to thousands of implementing and delegated acts. So there is some policy and file continuity. There is some stakeholder continuity because, of course, some MEPs, a number of MEPs have returned. Maybe there are 27 new commissioners coming, but there are still 54,000 other officials in the commission that actually have not changed jobs in the last few months. So there's people continuity, and of course the council has some continuity. So there is a big element of continuity, but there is then also a large element of change. There will be new files coming in line with the new direction that the institutions are looking to take. There are new stakeholders, notably in the Parliament. There will be new stakeholders in the sense that, the Commission may play musical chairs. So there will be some new DGs created and new groups, etc. So it's new stakeholders to that extent. There's also change with regard to the politics. The politics is changing. It's not what it was, and we're all going to have to learn how to deal with the new political environment in the EU. And there is a changing external environment, which is pretty much always the case. So change and continuity is pretty much the theme. And I think what I would like to push or to stress in the next 15 minutes is that this period of time is also a very good opportunity to look at continuity and change in our public affairs work. So it's the beginning of a 5-year cycle. It's an opportunity to look at, okay, so what do we do and how do we do it? What do we want to keep and what do we maybe wish to change, improve, dial up or dial down? So it's I think professionally speaking, it's a period where I've seen where most public affairs teams and professionals try to review a little bit, because before we start again and get set up, let's have a look at what we do and how we do it. Advocacy strategy has spent a lot of time trying to distill the work of public affairs professionals into something that's a little bit more digestible, something that shows us the key component parts of public affairs work. And we've managed to pull this into roughly 7 stages. Starting with how one identifies, and I think Paul mentioned this a few times, and I'm going to come back to it in a second, how you identify priorities and align with your organization, how you then do the process through KPIs and objectives of turning that into something actionable for you and your team that's also measurable so you can show back to your organization what it is you're doing and how you're succeeding. Once, and I really want to be clear about this, once you have the priorities set, then you can start looking at getting all of the information you need. This is your intelligence gathering, your monitoring services, your advisory services, aligned to the priorities and aligned to the information that you're looking to get. Okay, so now I know what I'm trying to do. I know that I'm getting the right information feeding in. That also then starts to tell you, okay, so once I've got all of the information, what am I going to process that information into? Am I going to process into timelines, issue updates? Okay, so some real review of what is the output of all of this information that I'm getting in. From all of that, you're then going to start thinking about what positions you are. So what positions, what we mean by this is well, there's actually two things in one here. So how are you going to turn all of this into your position papers and advocacy assets, given everything you know about the environment? Also, this is going to give you a lot of stakeholder information to allow you to do your stakeholder mapping. So again, to make some choices about who it is you would need to meet and when. In the middle of this process here, sitting right in the middle of the 7 steps, is how you are going to manage all of your information. So all of this information that you're gathering, collecting, processing, where are you putting it all and how are you managing it? This has always been important. In a first instance, this was very important for public affairs professionals who wanted to have access to their information easily amongst a team, for example. Then secondly, it became important to manage this and structure it well so that you could manage this in your office, but also on the go, in between your different devices and team members. And now it's even more important if you want to be able to leverage AI in your public affairs work correctly, because you need to have a robust data platform, i.e. you probably need to have it all in the same place. So how you manage it then becomes critical, before then moving out to doing your engagement. So as you can probably see there's a lot of preparation required before we believe that you can go out and do effective engagements. And then, of course, when you're doing engagement, that basically leads to 2 further things. It leads to how you're going to manage your campaigns, and it also looks at how you're going to evaluate what you're doing. Because the moment you go out and start engaging with your stakeholders, you're going to be getting feedback. We agree with this, we don't agree with that, we don't understand this, and therefore that gives you cause to review and to look at how you do things. So that's the broad scheme of public affairs steps. And again, I can formulate it in different ways, and I think this is just a slightly different way of putting the same thing into a slightly some of the key elements of these stages. So setting priorities and objectives and aligning with your organization. And this is one of 3 areas that I'm going to focus on next. Turning that into SMART objectives for public affairs is no easy task, as I'm sure all of you are aware. Making this very specific, very measurable, not having objectives like produce 5 newsletters, meet 10 stakeholders. Let's all professionally try to stay away from those types of objectives and have something more meaningful. That then moves into all of the different assets and your stakeholder maps and the message houses that you want to pull together. It also then feeds into your stakeholder mapping exercise. That then at a certain point leads you to build the actual strategy itself. Okay, so how are we going to go about deploying these assets to meet these stakeholders? What are the different ways we're going to do it? Are we going to do it directly? Are we going to do it indirectly? So if we're doing it ourselves, are we equipped? Who are the spokespeople? Is everybody on point, available? If we're doing it indirectly, i.e. through others, who are the best partners? Is it trade associations? I know there was a question there, for example, about some of these think tanks, especially some of the political group think tanks. What role could they play in my strategy, for example? And in your question, Tim, for example, if you're coming up with a strategy where you absolutely need to convince the EPP, well, using their think tank would make imminent sense. If you were trying to convince the socialists, you're probably not going to get too much value out of an EP think tank report to persuade the socialists. So again, thinking about your strategic choices and the partnerships that you wish to use. Then you're looking at how you manage it, the dashboards that you want to create to basically show other people your progress, but also keep a handle on things yourself. And then at the end, you're going to measure your success, evaluate, and basically try to feed back. And the critical thing here, and the reason why we break this down into steps, is that there is a sense of order in having these different steps, but the idea is that each step feeds other steps. But breaking it down, it can allow you to try and find best in class in each particular step. And I would like to focus here, and I see, Michelle, I'm stealing some of the questions because I'm watching them come in at the same time. So I'm just going to jump onto Andreas's question here. Okay, so for example, a smarter KPI or a smarter objective. So for example, meet 10 stakeholders. I'm assuming we can all agree is a really shocking objective or KPI. A good KPI there could be, meet 5 of our key priority identified stakeholders within the months of September and October to do X, Y, or Z, because you want to do something. Okay, so that feels that it's what you're doing is you're making it relevant who the stakeholders actually are. You're making it time bound because there's a window through which you want to meet them, and there's a reason why you want to meet them in that window. That hopefully, Andreas, gives you a bit of a better example. And the other example I gave of, your task is to produce 4 newsletters this year. Great, okay, who cares? Maybe you can switch that around, and you need to have 4 newsletters that go to the following key audiences. What we're looking for, what you will be measured on is, how many times this newsletter is quoted, forwarded, how many questions we get back, depending on what it is you're using that newsletter for. And this is the main point actually here, Andreas, is to have a smarter example or a better example of a KPI. It forces you to think about why you're doing something. So to get the smarter objective or KPI on your newsletter, well, why am I actually producing the newsletter? Okay, and that will then link hopefully back to something that's more concrete. Hopefully that answers your question, Andres, as I now jump into, I think, 3 things that we believe are pretty critical right now for public affairs professionals. So the first one is prioritization, and Paul mentioned this. I think he mentioned it quite a few times, which is good, because there's continuity, but there's also change. And I think everything that I'm assuming everybody on this call as a public affairs professional will appreciate is everybody has too many priorities. And if everything's priority, clearly nothing is priority. So as we roll through the autumn and implementing and delegated acts pick up again, as pending files most likely start to move ahead again, and as we get clarity on the work program, so for most people, that's going to mean some files that pick up. For other people, it maybe means files that they wanted to be in, that they're going to have to work on to get into work program 2026, as Paul described. So there's going to be a period towards January, February of next year where there's going to be a lot of files that we either want on the table or we don't want, but they are on the table. And it's a great moment to really have a robust prioritization system in place. And by robust, what I mean here is using this as a tool to align with your own organization on what your policy priorities are. And here you can use different metrics to assess. There's a bit of an example on the screen that you will see in the slides when they come around. This one is about impact on an organization and urgency. I think we can add several other criteria here to help you measure what is a priority for your organization. The idea of preparation now is there's 2 parts of a prioritization exercise, or in fact there are 3. The first part is setting up a process. Now is a good time to do that. The second part is running that process. January, February will be a great time to run that process. And thirdly, you have to review and update that, which probably twice a year. So probably July next year will be a great time to rerun the exercise. So at the moment, prioritization, thinking about this and how you're going to manage it so you don't become overwhelmed, is probably one of autumn's main tasks. Now, a second main task, and it's linked to the prioritization, it's about your monitoring and intelligence gathering. Now, that's particularly important right now because of what we've talked about, because of all of the things that Paul talked about in the nature of change. There's a lot of pending files coming up. Which ones are going to go forward? Which ones aren't? Implementing and delegated acts are kicking off. There's lots of new stakeholders around. We don't really know them. We don't know what they want. So now is a critical time to make sure that you have some very good monitoring and intelligence systems in place. It's an opportunity for you to review the ones that you already have, to review what's out in the market, and to make sure that you have the right monitoring and intelligence gathering strategy to take you forwards. Now, I say this, for example, and I've mentioned a few times, implementing and delegated acts, do you have the right monitoring and intelligence gathering in place for all the implementing and delegated acts you may face? Do your current providers cover this? It's worth checking, for example. So we really stress this as something that's, again, it's a critical phase because there's so much information, there's so much much context you need right now, that yes, monitoring and intelligence gathering will be the second key step that I think warrants attention this autumn. And obviously from that, the stakeholder mapping. This is something that as public affairs professionals, we're all much more familiar with. At least the activity of understanding who they are. Quite how we do it, whether we fill in Excel sheets and visualize it like this, is another question. But now is a time when everybody is most likely, or should be, updating their stakeholder maps. So how are you doing this? What software or what platform are you using to do this? How easy is it to use? How easy is it to update? How can you share this amongst a team? Are some of the questions you should be asking yourself, because effectively you will put in a large investment of time, I think, over the next 4 or 5 months to build up a relatively new stakeholder map, after which, of course, there will be variation over the coming years as stakeholders come and go. But the bulk of your stakeholder mapping work for the next 5-year legislative cycle is going to happen in the next 5 months. So before building this, you should really make sure you're building it in a way that is easy to use, easy to access, easy to visualize, so that you set yourself up for success for the next 4 to 5 years. Because I'm sure we all know how difficult it is if you suddenly decide in 9 to 12 months' time that you wish to change how you do this. Having already filled it in for 9 months becomes a little bit more complex. So those are the 3 steps that I would certainly, or that we would highlight as being pretty critical as we enter the autumn, and as the key parts of the 7 steps that people should focus on. So with that, that brings me to the end of the structured part. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor then of how we can marry up the milestones that Paul pointed out with a good public affairs structure, and perhaps 3 ideas of where attention should be focused right now to make the most of the public affairs work that you're going to be doing in the coming months. And with that, Michelle, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And again, another information and yeah, fantastic packed segment. So a couple more questions. We have a few more minutes. Alan, you suggest that public affairs professionals focus on priorities, intelligence, and stakeholder mapping right now, but aren't all steps important right now?
So I think so. Yes, and again, it's a good question, Michelle, because we have 7 steps, and in fact, in an ideal world, there would be a sequencing, but in the real world, everything happens at the same time. It's as they say in nice English, it's often like drinking from a fire hose. Okay, so yes, I think we are, as public affairs professionals, often doing a little bit of everything at the same time. I guess what my main point would be is right now, it will be good to put extra emphasis on the 3 that I mentioned, in the way you structure them, in the way you think about them, in the way you set yourself up, because this will be a bit of a foundation for the coming 5-year cycle. So, of course, at the moment, people should be out engaging with the new stakeholders. They should be meeting them. But actually, the reason for meeting most stakeholders right now is actually a part of a stakeholder map, is to get to know them, to build the relationships, to get information that you're then going to feed back into something. So, of course, all of the 7 steps are important at all moments of time, but I think at certain times emphasis should be placed on certain steps, and that will be my suggestion right now.
Okay, fantastic. So, and you you mentioned my next question was indeed going to be all this emphasis on planning, and what about being out there meeting people and getting to know people and getting to know stakeholders and potential stakeholders. But I think you've underlined that, to be able to do all of those things effectively, if you don't have a good plan and your priorities in place, everything else is going to be that much less effective. So I'm going to skip to the next question, which I'm sure you're going to have something to say about as well. You didn't really mention AI in here. How can AI help public affairs where it's at today? It's a developing field, but with what we have today, what role should AI play, or what role can it play?
Yeah, I think I think we've probably all observed that that's the subject of many other webinars right now, Michelle. But I will try to give a brief answer. And actually, it also relates back to the previous question you asked. And I think I hope I'm not going to upset anybody when I say this, but my belief is that over time, I've come to understand that effective and successful public affairs is something like 70% preparation, 30% action. And that's certainly not what I imagined when I walked into the profession 25 years ago. I imagined I would be out and doing stuff 75% of the time, with probably some stuff I had to do in the office 25% of the time. In reality, I find that it's actually increasingly the other way around. And this is coming to the AI point, Michelle, don't worry, because I think there is one area that AI can really help you, and there's one area where AI can't help you. So when you're actually physically in a meeting, AI can't help you. Okay, so when you're actually building those relationships, of course, it can help you prepare for them, and I'll come to that in a second, but it can't do it for you. Okay, so when you're out engaging, building relationships, the networks, etc., AI for me is not there. It's not something that you can use. Now, the preparation, all of the things that we discussed in preparation, prioritization, information, intelligence, the gathering of it, the processing of it, the conversion into documents, the stakeholder mapping, AI can help with all of that. AI can help you do it. It can help you process it. It can help you visualize it. It can help you turn it into reports. So I think that there is enormous potential for AI in public affairs in that 75% preparation phase that we all have to go through. So, and imagining that AI, again, and my personal sense from playing around and trying this, Michelle, is that AI can take me from 0 to 80% in roughly 5 seconds, the time it takes to respond to me. And then I always have to polish, turn, correct. But that's so much easier to do. So it can actually address that balance. I think AI could help you become 50% preparation and 50% external. So it can free people up to do the job that most people thought they were going to be doing when they took the job.
That's a great take. That is really actually helping increase the ratio of your time or the portion of your time that you're out there networking and talking to people, which is what public affairs ultimately is about. Okay, then just one last question, because we're still pretty good with the clock. We all know, everyone in this webinar knows that stakeholder mapping is a huge part of advocacy activity. It's key. It's a basis in many ways. Either of you, Paul or Alan, what wisdom can you share in addition to what we all think we know about this? It's something we all do. It gets talked a lot about. What could you add for us today?
Maybe as Paul looks to be furiously writing some notes, I'll make a start. So I think, okay, so the one thing I will stress for stakeholder mapping, again, it's from my own personal experience of having done this, and I will put my hand up for I'm going to tell you everything that I never did. Okay, so it's kind of like, don't listen to the guy who didn't take his own advice, but I'll try. Stakeholder is something that I should have done with much more discipline. I should have done this with much more regularity, and I should have done this more professionally. So what do I mean by that is it means I should have really had a better software format place to keep and manage my stakeholder data. I should have been more regular at updating it and inputting it. It was, I'd meet people, I would then forget about this, I wouldn't put them into my stakeholder map. So it's constantly something that was there that I kind of should have done, but never really did. So a good stakeholder map takes discipline on a good platform. Paul will now tell you how to fill that in effectively, right, Paul?
No. But I agree that, the platform matters for a lot. And increasingly, I hear people are taking a much more CRM-based approach. So on the one hand, mapping is an opportunity for you to analyze the influence and the ability to influence and the positioning of actors on a specific file. But in doing so, you're capturing so much more valuable information on not just their position, but also their contact information, creating a CRM database of all the key actors that can be repeatedly used over time. And that requires, like you say, group effort, it requires also considering how that group can add a layer of their own data. And I think this, GDPR compliant additional data, that internal value, that isn't something you can replicate and buy from another service provider. You can buy, of course, the key overhanging data, but what you want to know is, of course, what was the outcome of the different meetings you've had and the interactions, and to store and save and use that information. So taking a software-based approach, a CRM-based approach, and potentially more scientific approach in terms of how you go about, what are the means of verification, how are you actually going to measure, less gut and more science, I think is a very important element of stakeholder mapping. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks both. Okay, we got one last question from the audience. So I'm just going to quickly throw it out there, and we still have a few minutes, so we have time to hit this. I just have to, maybe even another one after that. Miriam Alba asks, I am interested in the advocacy that organizations do through other actors, so to speak, a secondary advocacy of some sort. Do you have scenarios for which that advocacy format is particularly relevant, and how can we combine it with direct engagement?
I can see Paul is writing again, so I'll also jump in. So in some way, Miriam, I think actually what you're describing, at least as I read it here, is what I would call actually almost a best practice in public affairs, and that's the creation of an echo chamber, where indeed your message is echoed by others. Now, you can either let that happen organically, so hope that other people pick up your message and take it on, or you can orchestrate that by having your own message directly, working with your trade association, maybe working with some journalists to plant some stories around the same time. So I think the kind of what you call secondary advocacy, I'm thinking that this is more of an echo chamber. This is extremely active in Brussels. This is what a lot of consultancies are advising clients to do. It's why there are so many think tanks. It's why there are so many academics. It's why there's so many news outlets. It's all part of this broader echo chamber, Miriam. So I think it can be combined. It should almost be combined. There are cases when it's perhaps not so relevant, but as a general principle, I think you're actually describing a best practice. Maybe, Paul, you're about to violently disagree with me?
No, I don't have really anything to add to that other than, for me, I often also emphasize it as a way of amplifying your messages, through your formal and your informal networks. And the level of sophistication you want to apply to that is really dependent on your resources and your skills. But as a practice, indeed, it is essential really in this very crowded environment to develop those strategies where direct engagement really isn't enough anymore.
Great. Okay. Thanks. And we are at time now. So I'm going to just quickly wrap this up. Thank you very much. We had great attendance today. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate your interest and your attention. We are going to send the deck around. We know it's packed with a lot of information. And you may have further questions. Please do not hesitate to email us. Please do email us with your questions, and we will be getting back to you with answers. So thank you again, and thank you to our presenters today, Alan and Paul. Thank you very much. And I wish all of you a fantastic rest of your Wednesday. And see you soon. We're going to be doing more of these, so keep your eyes peeled for our LinkedIn page. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.